Welcome to the Twin Bill Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Bolohan. It's hard to compare players across eras, especially guys from the early 1900s like Mike Donlin. But I'm going to try anyways. He hit like Tony Gwynn, was a star in New York like Derek Jeter, quit his sport at the peak of his career like Michael Jordan, was in the Taylor Swift-Travis Kelce relationship at the time, and went on to have an acting career like Jim Brown. Steve Steinberg and Lyle Spatz's book, Mike Donlin, A Rough and Rowdy Life, from New York baseball idol to stage and screen, covers this amazing and somehow forgotten player. The book is fascinating, and I had a great time talking to Steve. Enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, Steve. How you doing today?
I'm doing well. Glad to have the opportunity to share about a ball player that's been overlooked and has a fascinating story.
It is truly a fascinating story. I couldn't believe it after reading the book. He really lived a life that you do not expect anyone to live. He kind of lived the peak of at the time, I feel like. He lived to the greatest extent possible.
Yeah, Michael Donlin can sort of underline that saying that truth is stranger than fiction.
I want to start at the beginning. He starts his life off with a real tragedy. Both of his parents die in a train crash.
His mother died in what was a spectacular train crash where she fell when the train was going over a ravine and hung on some phone wires for many, many hours before falling to her death. And she actually had one of her children in her arms at the time who actually survived, because when she fell, her daughter, Mike's sister, got hooked by a branch. And I think you can understand his aggressive, somewhat personality as maybe a way of coping with all the loss that he had in his...
Yeah, well, now I was going to lead right into that. Great segue here. He really is, at least early in his life, this very sort of like rough and tumble guy. He never wanted to turn down a fight. He goes to prison. He drinks. What is this early life like for him?
Well, yeah, it was a very tough life, and he did drink and got in trouble and ended up missing the 1902 season when he was in prison. And a couple of years earlier, he had almost lost his life, where he was teasing somebody in a bar, even to the point when he was drunk of running his fingers through the beard of a fellow bar patron who didn't take too well to it. And the guy's buddy then took a knife and sliced Mike from ear to ear, and luckily for Mike, it didn't go very deep, although the scar remained for the rest of his life. So he just was one heck of an aggressive guy, and certainly in the ballpark, he took that out with umpires. And he and John McGraw, who had a long relationship and on teams together, sort of fed each other and their tempers against umpires.
I wanted to talk about McGraw because they do have a very interesting and complicated relationship that kind of stretches for most of his career. What was that relationship like?
It was complicated. First of all, people may not realize how young McGraw was at the time. He was a teammate of Donlin's in 1900. He took over as part owner and manager of the first year of the American League, the Baltimore Orioles, only 5 years older than Donlin. And he suffered some real tragedy in his early life when his mother and I think a bunch of his siblings in some outbreak of disease were killed. And it was complicated as Mike went on through his life. McGraw probably resented the fact that Donlin did take time out for things that we'll discuss later and wasn't on the Giants because he was busy with a woman he loved and making money elsewhere. But McGraw obviously admired his toughness. And of course, Donlin and Lyle and I, my co-author Lyle Spatz and I, were actually blown away by how great a hitter we're talking about here. This guy had a .333 career batting average in over 1,000 games, even though he missed about the equivalent of 5 or 6 seasons during his peak due to different reasons.
It sounds like he was truly a great player. And during his New York stint, he was almost like the Derek Jeter of New York at the time. He really was this major star in New York.
Yeah, he reveled under the neon lights of Broadway, and in 1908, which was a famous season of the Merkle game, one of the New York newspapers ran a contest for the most popular ball player in New York, and Christy Mathewson was far behind, and Donlin was number one. And now Donlin's been forgotten, and Mathewson is sort of an icon and a legend. So it sort of gives us pause about what is fame and how does it last and how that happens. Because Mike's pretty much fallen off a cliff in terms of awareness. Even I did a paper on him, at the SABR convention, the National Convention of Society of American Baseball Research. And so many people came up to me afterwards and said, gosh, I just didn't know anything about this guy.
He ends up winning a World Series. He is this star player. And then 1907 comes along, and he makes a pretty controversial decision. What happens in 1907?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned, because that was actually the topic of my paper that I delivered on Saturday, because it's such a fascinating year. In the 1906 year, which was the year after they won the championship, he broke his ankle. That was the reason why he missed most of that year. And he fell in love with a very famous vaudeville actress and married her in 1906, and just did not want to be away from her as 1907 rolled around. And so he and his wife, Mabel Height, they came up with a salary demand, which they thought would give them cover to sort of gracefully leave the game. And it got to the point that John McGraw wanted Donlin so badly that he said, well, I'm going to pay that $600 out of my own pocket. And Donlin came down to spring training, played a couple days. He hadn't signed his contract yet. And then he went back home because Mabel was in Chicago performing. And this is before he went on stage or anything. So it wasn't a monetary thing. He was paid $50, I think, a week to be the assistant manager of the theater she headlined in. And he stayed in Chicago. It was a pretty interesting season in terms of what developed there. But he stayed in Chicago because he wanted to be with a woman he loved. And she really provided him, I think, with a security and a love that he never, had in his life up until that time.
Who was Mabel Height? She is such a key figure in Mike's life.
She was one of the great vaudeville actresses of the time. We don't have any remaining surviving YouTube of her, because we'll talk about what happened to her at a very young age. And I've spent a lot of time, this book, really getting my hands around, and our hands around vaudeville and early Hollywood, added about a year to the research of the book. I would suggest that she was probably Lucille Ball mixed with equal parts of Carol Burnett, with maybe sprinkling a Phyllis Diller a little bit in there. She was a very goofy character, and the vaudeville skits were usually brief skits, but she had a surprisingly sharp business mind. And when Mike would waver, when there were salary issues with the Giants, she would usually step in and say, we're not going to play. And Mike was really missing baseball, and she would say, well, we're not going to play until we get, what we want from the Giants. A fascinating and immensely talented woman who has been forgotten now, even more so than Mike, because, again, we'll get into what happened to her.
Is this kind of like a Taylor Swift, Travis Kelce kind of thing? Is that like that level of fame we're talking about at the time?
It really is. And one of my SABR colleagues had mentioned the phrase power couple, and they really were a power couple long before the phrase existed. Will Rogers weaves in and out of our book, the famous humorist and entertainer, and he said when they got married in 1906, it was an enormous event in the Society of Pages of New York. And when he joined his wife on stage at opening night at Hammerstein's Theater in 1908, which we'll talk about, Will Rogers decades later said, I had never heard in my entire career such a roar from the audience, both when they came on and the numerous encores when they finished their skit. So yeah, this was huge, and they were on the society pages, as for their loving relationship, not just the sports pages.
So he takes that year off in 1907. I can remember when Michael Jordan stepped away and played baseball, and people were just incredulous about this. Like, this is an insane thing. Is it kind of the same reaction that he had?
It probably was. A lot of people, of course, the Jordan, the things remain murky. And in the case of Donlin, just to finish the story, he went on to play semi-pro ball with a very famous semi-pro team. And in Chicago, there were 1,000 Sandlot and semi-pro games on a typical weekend. And Chicago was the head of the center of the baseball world, because the Cubs and the White Sox had been in the World Series. And when Donlin took off in 1907, a lot of people thought he was bluffing. And because of his love of his wife, he didn't come back. And then after the 1908 season, we'll find it again. And I don't know, we can talk or think about who actually willingly walked away at the height of his fame and at the peak of his athletic career I just got done reading a Jim Brown bio, and I want to pick up a Barry Sanders bio, to delve into that. Obviously, these are very different kind of people than Donlin, but just walking away from the game at that height and not just threatening to do it or holding out and then coming back.
Well, I grew up a Detroit Lions fan, and I
Okay.
can
Oh,
also remember
wow.
what I remember. Unfortunate until very recently, but I
Right.
can remember when Barry stepped away, and he just disappeared. But
Yeah.
Mike doesn't disappear. He comes back the next year after he steps away for that 1 year. He kind of picks up where he left off, has like a very good season, and then he goes away again. But
Yeah.
this time it's a little bit different. He's even almost maybe even a bigger star.
The numbers that I throw out there to give people an example, he was making about $6,000 a year as a Giant, very high salary at the time. Both Honus Wagner and McGraw were making, more, maybe like 10,000. He and Mabel, when they opened on Broadway for their vaudeville performance, were pulling down $2,000 a week, which is a
Wow.
mind-boggling number in 1908. And then in 1909 and 1910, they were touring the country doing vaudeville performances. She taught him the ropes. He was really not a bad performer at all. He wasn't as great as she was, and she really carried the weight. But it was remarkable to go from one. And here again, Jim Brown a little bit, because unlike Barry Sanders, Brown did have some success in Hollywood. Uh, um, but yeah, amazing story there.
Yeah. So they perform something called Stealing Home. What can you tell me about Stealing Home?
Well, vaudeville skits back in that day were not uh, real long. They were maybe 10 minutes, 12 minutes. Theirs, I think, was 18 minutes long. So when you went to the theater, you would see a series of things to entertain you. And a little bit, we've come the full circle with television now, with a lot of these variety shows that are almost like vaudeville skits. So it was a skit basically where Donlin is comes home to his wife Mabel, and she asks him how many hits he had, and he said, "Well, I almost had one today," and the umpire threw him out of the game, and they were playing the Pirates, and his big rival Honus Wagner had four, and so it's sort of a baseball related skit, and she's upset with him, but at the end they sort of make up. Again, I've never seen this skit; it doesn't survive on tape anywhere. Um, but at the end, they make up and they do this amazing little dance routine that he had practiced for gosh knows how long. People were saying that during the late in the eighth season, he would be in the outfield between innings, and you'd see him sort of tapping around, like maybe practicing his footwork. And they opened at Hammerstein's Theater, which was the vaudeville venue at the time. The Asghar Hammerstein that we may know in terms of a lyricist. This would have been, I believe, it would have been his grandfather. And Willie Hammerstein just brought notorious people. There's one story that we tell in the book, and it may be apocryphal, where a man came up to Willie Hammerstein and said, "If you pay me $1,000, let me on stage, I will commit suicide right on stage." And Hammerstein paused and then said, "Well, what will you do for an encore?" And that guy was never did perform on stage.
So in the book, there seemed to be kind of varying opinions on his acting ability. Reading the book, my takeaway was like he was actually better than I think people kind of gave him credit for. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I really do. I think there have been some more contemporary people that say that he wasn't, but he really was a pretty decent actor. And one of the really surprising things that we found is in 1930 he actually appeared on Broadway in a drama. And Ed Sullivan, who went on to become a famous TV variety host in the 1930s, had a gossip column, and he connected with Donlin long after Donlin's career and just talked about how great he was in this role in this drama with a famous actor Paul Muni.
So he ends up doing this show, I believe it's for 2 years, and then he ends up returning to baseball. Why did he return to baseball as opposed to continuing, say, with vaudeville?
Well, I think he realized, and also Mabel realized, that if the distance between being a sports star and being away from it gets too long, it sort of wears off some of the excitement and the variety. So he did come back to the Giants. McGraw did not keep him for very long and traded him to a very bad Boston National League team. And here's Mike, I believe he's now 34 years old. And in the month of September, this team that was more than 50 games out of first place. And in September, Donlin comes and has more than 100 at bats and hits more than 400. So he didn't wrap it up, at that time. He was still playing and hoping that he would prove to the Giants that they made a mistake in trading him away.
So, we talked about Mike's sort of rough beginnings. It seems like Mabel really did mellow him out. It seemed like a very genuine love story, that they were really great for each other.
Mabel did really. I mean, he had one famous breakdown in 1907 where he got drunk and it made all the newspapers American. And she was very open about her sadness and dealing with it. And they were pretty much inseparable. In 1912 in Harlem, she was on a stage and she collapses at the age of 29. They thought it was appendicitis. They opened her up. And actually, the C word was mentioned then. I very rarely see in microfilm the word cancer, although we still don't know to this day what kind of cancer it was. And, it went on. But by October that year, she was dead at the age of 29. And once again, he had the anchor of his life just ripped out from under him. And once again, he had to overcome it and move forward, which he did.
We talked about John McGraw earlier. John McGraw comes back into the story here when he brings Mike along on this sort of world tour for baseball, which is an incredible thing to be happening in 1913.
A bunch of ball players, mainly from the Giants and Charles Comiskey's White Sox, toured the country, heading as far west as Seattle. And some players like Christy Mathewson, who I think did not like riding on ships on open ocean, did not continue with the tour. And then these teams went on. They started in the Far East and they went all the way to play in what was then called Ceylon, the country's, I think it's Sri Lanka now, all the way to where they ended the tour playing baseball in front of the King of England. And there actually is a book that has been written about that world tour, the winter of 13-14. And McGraw, perhaps because he felt sorry for the widower, Donlin, perhaps also because he wanted to make sure that he had a drinking buddy. And I think after Mabel died, and after Donlin had the outburst in 1907, and Mabel said, "This is it," it seems pretty clear that he did not drink again for the rest of their marriage, but he did, resume drinking after her death. And McGraw took him along, and he played very well. There's no statistics there. And McGraw actually signed him for the 1914 season, which was Donlin's sort of last and brief hurrah.
One thing I caught about the world tour, does he ride on the Lusitania?
I think they returned on the Lusitania
Yes, that's what it was.
New York.
Mm-hmm.
And it was sort of a wild scene. And of course, that boat became very famous because it later sunk. And, there's a recent book that's been written about it. And it was a pretty wild scene when they came back, because at that time there was a new upstart league called the Federal League. And it was a wild scene as the players got off the Lusitania. There were recruiters from the Federal League with big bills, I don't know, maybe $100 bills in their pocket, trying to get ball players. And there were a number of ball players that did jump to the Federal League, which played a couple seasons before it folded. So yes, the Lusitania, which a couple years later was to go down like the Titanic.
There were so many things in the book that are just almost like a Forrest Gump kind of thing.
You mentioned the Lusitania because when the Titanic went down in 1912, before Mabel had collapsed, I think the Titanic went down in April and she collapsed in June. They were trying to adopt a couple kids who lost their parents in the Titanic. And we don't know the details of it. They were unsuccessful. And perhaps whatever agency looked at it said, "Hey, these two entertainers are not going to make model parents." But I know how disappointed they were. They never did have children in the 5-6 years of their marriage.
So 1914, he marries Rita Ross, who in the book, and maybe this is just kind of how she was, she doesn't seem to have nearly as much of a presence as Mabel does.
Yeah, she really disappears. And gosh, we look hard. And I spent a lot of time pouring through microfilm of New York newspapers. She came from a very famous acting family. Her uncle and aunt who raised her were a husband-wife team. And she's really, other than, one or two times where she's featured in the newspaper, she stuck around with him. And it was Will Rogers again who made the comment that he was very fortunate to marry a beautiful woman and a girl considerably younger than him. And in the book, we actually have a little picture of her but I think it's actually from a newspaper clipping because we could not find a picture. So it's not great quality, but I always believe, and I'm really into old wire photos, that, if you have a really rare image, then you can accept lesser quality just to be able to convey, what this woman looked like. And she stayed with him for the rest of his life. And I think, they did have some incidents of where they had to deal with his drinking. I'm sure he wouldn't make headlines because he was no longer a star. You don't hear about a retired ball player from 20 years ago who goes off and does something as much as, today's star.
Sure. He goes into film, and it's fascinating. It seems like he gets continually more opportunities. He's not really a star, I don't think, in film, but he does have a long career in
Yeah,
film.
he actually was in one feature film, which arguably may have been the first time that a ball player was featured. It was supposedly the story of his life in 1915. And it was sort of cleaned up, like alcoholism is not mentioned in there any more than when Ronald Reagan played Grover Cleveland Alexander in a movie in the 1950s. His alcoholism, I don't think, was mentioned in there. So Donlin had that big starring role. And then beyond that, he ended up moving to Hollywood in the early 1920s, and he really became a beloved guy on the backlots of Hollywood. And perhaps if people are listening here, they're thinking, God, this guy was such a scoundrel, he in prison and drinking, blah, blah, blah. But he really had a softer side. People in Hollywood loved him, and he appeared with some not so good actors and actresses and some very famous ones and famous directors. And they would bend over backwards to try to get him in a small role. There's actually a film clip that you can still see if you Google it under Turner Movie Classics, a movie with William Powell called One Way Passage. And Mike is on as a bartender for about a minute, mixing the perfect drink before he hands it to Powell, who bumps into the actress and spills his drink on her. That's how he connects with her in the movie. So IMDb, the database, probably lists Donlin in close to 50 movies. We think he was probably in 100. Many have, movies have not survived. I have a colleague who's really into old movies, and she'll buy a DVD and say, hey, go to 47 minutes and 37 seconds. And there you'll see Mike Donlin briefly. So, and his two very close friends and drinking buddies were two very famous actors that we can talk a bit about. So
He was in The General, which has become an early classic with Buster Keaton, which is incredible. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think he plays a Civil War soldier. It's really interesting because the movie The General was panned at the time mainly because, how can you dare do a movie about the Civil War and make it a comedy? And it's tragic because Keaton, as I understand it, after that movie really lost total control and he had to just do whatever MGM told him to do. And now that movie has been ranked by, what is it, the American Film Theater Critics or whatever, one of the top 100. I think it's even in the top 20 movies of all time. And Keaton was a fanatic baseball fan. When they filmed the General in Cottage Grove, Oregon, they fixed up the ball field there. And Keaton was always known that if they were filming and they hit a rough spot, it would be timeout, let's play 9. And you had to be able to play baseball to work on his crew.
I love that. John Barrymore, another guy that he ends up becoming very close with too.
Yeah. Barrymore, I had known beforehand that he had a serious drinking problem. I hadn't known that Keaton had it as early as he did. He had a series of unhappy marriages. But John Barrymore and Donlin were very close. And when Mike got very sick in the mid 1920s, it was Barrymore that organized the huge benefit for him in Los Angeles. And Barrymore even appeared and did his Hamlet soliloquy that I think he had done in London in 1922, and it was considered the greatest Hamlet performance of all time. I don't know if anybody ranks and I don't even know if that thing survives on the YouTube. I've never searched for it. So
there was a brief mention in the book. He may have been in the first talking film. I mean, obviously not the jazz singer, but there was an early form of a talking movie that he was in.
Yeah, he was making. It's a fascinating thing that you picked up on because he was making a movie in the late 1920s, and one of the camera guys said, "Well, I remember when I was a little boy, I saw this movie, and what it was is when he and Mabel went on stage and did Stealing Home. Shortly thereafter, there was a company called Camera Phone, and basically what would happen is The skit was filmed, and then it was recorded. They're singing and dialogue on records, which I think were 78s at the time. And basically, was those records were and film was sent all over the country, and you could be sitting in somewhere in Oklahoma, and that story came out mainly because that film guy, he loved Donlin so much, and he said he went to the theater almost every day, that he knew every word of dialogue when maybe he was a 10-year-old kid at that time. And, the Jazz Singer and Talkies didn't come out, until later in the 1920s. As a matter of fact, we realized that there was a period of maybe a couple of years that movies were released both ways. A movie would be released both as a talkie and as a silent film, because there was a lot of conversation that maybe the silent films would edge out. I mean, Charlie Chaplin always felt the silent films were better because you could use your imagination. So that's an interesting little aside there.
The guy hit 333 for his career. I mean, he frankly just didn't play long enough
Right.
for injury or leaving to do the theater. But this was a truly great player who had a Hall of Fame path, I think.
Right. Yeah, he played about probably the equivalent of 8.5 seasons, and missed 5 peak seasons. Most of them in 1906 with the broken ankle, and in 1902 in prison. He had little parts of the season that he played, but yeah, one can only wonder. And like I said, the amazing thing is, he has been, so forgotten, and he was, really, he was the man. He was the most popular athlete in New York, very popular probably across America, maybe not in Chicago where the hated Cubs were. But he was a bad boy, and maybe a lot of kids growing up, they like to model themselves maybe on somebody who's not, Mr. Clean. So,
well, and so this is kind of the big question here, which we've been kind of hinting at. So how does this person, who is this incredible baseball player, is so involved in the theater and movies, how does he end up getting forgotten? Do you have any feel for that now?
Well, the feel that I might have for it is more because of my writing career, and Lyle and I have tended to write about people that have been forgotten, like Urban Shocker, who was a star pitcher on the great 27 Yankees, who was dying of heart disease while he posted an 18-6 record. And I just think one of the things that really drives me to write these kinds of books is to sort of recover or rediscover or uncover people that have been forgotten. And I think it's the analogy I use is there's a lot of stars out there in the sky. They haven't gone away, but there's just so many of them, and some come brighter and they're more recent. We remember them. There's that bias of recency. You'll go to a ball game and you'll say, that was the greatest game I ever saw. But, maybe there was a game 15 years ago that your memory isn't as sharp. In the case of Mathewson, he died tragically. He served in the war, and there are things like that. And yeah, it is interesting. You look at TV stars. Will Taylor Swift be remembered 100 years from now? I can't tell you. I mean, we don't know. It's a fickle thing, and it's quite temporary sometimes. Fame and certainly celebrity is temporary, because by definition, yesterday's celebrity is no longer a celebrity.
But since the book has come out, is there anything that you've learned or had an interaction or anything that you wish you had in the book?
Well, first of all, in terms of what we wish we had, I think I wish that I would have found a photograph of him and McGraw together, the two of them, which I'm surprising I never did. And, so many photographs have been lost. Every year that you go back towards 1900, I think there's an exponential loss of photographs. So many more from the 20s than, let's say, the teens, and certainly the aughts. And a little bit more on their relationship. The most interesting thing I think I'd have that sometimes when you're doing research, you just stumble upon things and that just sort of are mind-boggling. But in 1908, arguably the most famous pennant race of all time, the Giants end up with the hated Cubs tied, and there's a one-game makeup of the Merkle game. And Donlin hated the Cubs, and he hated Johnny Evers, who was the star in the Cubs. And the Giants lost that game. And after that game, Donlin went up to Hugh Fullerton, a very famous writer who would be the one who would uncover the Black Sox scandal, and said, Hugh, I'm going to tell you something that you can never repeat again. I am glad the Cubs won the game. And I hope you will excuse me here, Scott, that I'm not going to reveal why you like the book, but basically, Fullerton sat on the story until 1922 when he did reveal the story. You know, he was a little concerned Donlin would be upset with him, but Fullerton said that it really revealed the decency and the humanity of this guy, a whole another side of him. And sometimes, you know, you have people that have this bravado, and Donlin was known as Turkey Mike because he had this strut. He would strut up to the plate. And, you know, we were able to convince our publisher, University of Nebraska Press, that's done all of our 4 books together, to give us a blurb on the back cover from someone who was dead for 80 or 90 years. And that was the famous writer Damon Runyon, who said that Donlin was far more colorful than Babe Ruth. The excitement of seeing Donlin walk up to the plate, Ruth may have hit more home runs, but this guy had more color. And I can't say it any better than Damon Runyon can, so I'll leave it at that.
That was Steve Steinberg. Stephen Lyle's book, Mike Donlin, A Rough and Rowdy Life from New York baseball idol to stage and screen, is out now. To close us out, we have C.M. Gigliotti reading her poem from our latest issue.
Hi, I'm C.M. Gigliotti, and today I'll be reading my poem, 10-Cent Beer Night. Cleveland's a hell I love in June. The air I breathe would have killed anyone that half-century ago. Not all diamond dust clouds are created equal, but I'm built for it. In fact, I'm damn near Z, getting my history from Substacks about traditions that gave my ancestors the bright idea to bring up kids there. What were they thinking, creating the world like that? The line is finer than we could have guessed between opening the gate and breaching the dugout. A land flowing with something like milk and honey, but Sodom and Gomorrah were proud too. I almost see Billy Martin's lips shaping, "Look out, stranger, I'm a Texas Ranger," as he mounted his rescue charge. It's thanks to nights like this that we invent a need for gladiators today. As if everyone had a cause to fight for, and no one had a last judgment to face.
We talk to people in and around baseball literature every week on the podcast and publish around 50 writers every year in the Twin Bill Literary Journal. You can support us on Patreon. Until next time,